Today is March 27th, 1995 in Rogers City, Michigan. Got a beautiful day today. And I've been asked by my brother George to put down a few notes of things that I remember about our dad, George W. Grambo. Things that he thought that I would know that maybe some of the other kids in the family did not know. Of course, I knew him a little bit longer than some of you people did, and so probably there are a few things. Dad was born December 20th, 1881, on the family farm in Metz Township, the same farm that our cousin Gerald occupies today. Herman Grambo had bought that land at the time that he got married to a Ernestine Bright from Alpena. The family had come from Germany. They had been in New York for a while, near Tonawanda or Buffalo. And then the family moved to Alpena by boat. And his father, Christian Grambo, and the rest of the family moved to the farm in Belknap Township, Section 12, where Christian had bought a farm. And Herman stayed in Alpena for a while and worked in one of the mills. And while there, he met this Ernestine Bright, or Bright Kreutz was the name, a German name. She had also come from Germany. And they got married. And probably along about 1885 or so, I guess. And from there, he acquired this land in Metz Township, and they moved up from Alpena. I assume that they came overland by way of Posen, along Rapids. But I know that the Christian Grambo family moved by boat up to Crawford's Quarry and then walked inland to Section 12 of Belknap Township. It would have been a much easier distance to walk than I have to walk or take a horse and buggy or whatever it is all the way from Alpena. Well, anyway, Herman was born on that farm there, no doubt born in a log house, the same house that I remember as a kid. Some of you people also remember the old log house. And I imagine that Herman and other friends had put that place together. It was a log cabin, and it was framed in logs. It was about a story and a half high, and I gather it was probably about 24 by 24, 24 by 28, and had a lean-to on one end of it that was used as a kind of a shed. There was a large room with one room off in the corner, and it had a loft with a ladder going up to it, and that's where the kids slept in later years. And it also had a cellar, a small root cellar, which was very common in those days. I don't know how big it was, I never did see it, but it had a trap door that led to it. That was very common in the early days, the earthen cellar, where they kept their vegetables for over the wintertime. It also had a small root cellar attached to it that extended out beyond the house itself. And there were other vegetables were stored as they were gathered. Now, George, our dad, was born in 1881. And then a couple years later, his sister Emma came along. Emma married a Julius Schultz, the one that settled in Canada. And then a couple years later, in 1885, Uncle Henry came along. Then in 1887, his sister Helen came along in December of 1987. And the mother, Ernestine, died in childbirth. The baby survived. And a neighbor by the name of Mrs. Brino took the child. And that child was raised by Mrs. Brino. She never did get back to the Granville home. Well, but our dad was about 6 years old when that happened. He said he remembers part of the story, but not all of it. And then, of course, it became a problem of what to do with the three kids. There was George and Emma and Henry. So Herman, the dad, he went over to see one of the neighbors, a family by the name of Schott, S-C-H-O-T-T. Now, Schott had 4 daughters and a son, and the oldest daughter, name was Amelia. And he went over to see whether he couldn't hire her for a period of time to come in and take care of the kids and do a little housekeeping, because after all, he had a farm to take care of too. He had horses and cattle and things that had to be watched. And so they apparently agreed that Amelia would go over there. She was the oldest, and she had been somewhat accustomed to handling young kids because she had 3 younger sisters and a younger brother. And so she knew something about housekeeping, she knew something about kids, she knew something about cooking, she knew something about farm animals, and so she went over. And I'll tell you more about her experiences later. And she went over there right at a few days after, even before the funeral had taken place. Now, she mentioned afterwards, she mentioned to Marion, whom she got to know quite well, and Marion got to know her quite well, that when she went over there, the body of the mother had been set aside waiting for a coffin and rough box to come. And they had somebody make a coffin. There were carpenters in the area who made coffins on order and made rough boxes on order. Now, a rough box is the equivalent of today what we call our vault, but they used wood at that time. And the death was verified by some coroner, some county office, she said. And the coffin was set up in the home, and was right in the home where they held a service. She says she just doesn't remember who the minister was that conducted the service, but she said it was a minister. And there were probably 25 or 30 people that had gathered for the event. And after, this was in the wintertime, this was December, the rough box and the coffin inside was, the rough box had been taken over to the cemetery already. The cemetery was located at what we call the Schrader Cemetery. That's where Grandma's buried, and some of the other relatives are buried in that cemetery. It's only about a quarter of a mile away from the Schott home where Amelia lived. And she said that the day after the service, the coffin was loaded on a sleigh, and she and other people on other sleighs went to the cemetery, which would have been about a mile away. And she said she took George with her. The other 2 children, she had somebody watch. And then, but to move on with the story, after that, then of course, it became a question of getting down to work. Life went on. And this happened in December. She died December 15th, 1887. That's 24 years before I was born. In fact, it was before Mother was born. Our mother, Alma, hadn't been born yet when that happened. And so what happened was that by February of the next year of 1888, Herman and Amelia were married. Now, as I gather the story, in those days, it didn't look quite right for a young girl like that to be home alone out there in the country with a married man who had been married. And so to make it look good, I suppose probably Herman asked, well, I know this from what Amelia told me, I know told Marion, that Herman went over and asked her father and mother whether they had any objection to his marrying her. And I suppose under the circumstances they said no. If it was all right with Amelia, and Amelia said it was all right with her. And so they were married within 6 weeks after the first wife died. But necessity is the mother of invention. And then, of course, in a period of time, or a period of about, I would say maybe about 10 years or 9 years, she had 5 children with Herman. There was Willie that came along in 89, Otto in 91, Ed in 94, Martha in 96, and Irma in 97. So you can see there was a house full of kids. So Dad said that he got plenty of opportunity to babysit and help out because he was the oldest. Now that the home itself was, Dad said it was very adequate. It was warm, and that's what Mother said too, that they didn't have much, but they had each other. And there was a stove, and the upstairs later on was divided into 2 areas. One side was for the boys, one side was for the girls. They had a ladder that went up. Now, she said that later on there was a steps that was built that was attached to the wall, regular step, a full step area, so that you didn't have to put your hands down to crawl up. You could walk up just like you did in the stair. But that, she said, that was sometime later that they put that regular stairway, attached it to the wall where this door went to the upstairs. So Amelia was settled down there with a group of 8 kids. Now, as I say, the girl Helen was raised by this Brino family, and she never did come back home. Mrs. Brino raised her, and then later on, although there was no, the girl did come over, they did visit, but she said that the girl just was attached to, of course, to the mother that took her in, and it was very comfortable. And then, of course, she later went on and got married. In fact, Helen was married 3 times, 3 different times. Now, I asked Dad, I said, just one, now the way this happened was this, that of course I got to know Dad quite well because I hunted and fished, and he loved to hunt and fish. Herman didn't particularly care for it, so at every chance he would take me with him hunting. I went duck hunting. Even as a little kid, I used to go duck hunting with him. He loved to duck hunt. He loved to partridge hunt. He loved to go down to Swan Lake and hunt ducks. And he took me along with him. Even as a little kid, sometimes he almost had to carry me. And the same was true with trout fishing. He loved to trout fish, as you well know. And he was a good fisherman. He was one of the best trout fishermen, brook trout fishermen that I know of. He caught a lot of fish. He knew how to catch fish. And he showed me a lot of the tricks of the trade that he knew and found out by himself in the early days. He said that at about 5 or 6, he started to go to school. There was a log school built on the same site as what we know of as the Grambo School. Grandfather Grambo had donated the land for the building of a school. The neighbors got together and put up a wood building, a log building. And that log building was there for many, many years. They did put up a frame building in 1903, and that's the one that you and I remember. And the log building stayed there for many, many years after that. It was used as a shed or a wood shed. Now that log school building also served for township purposes. They held town meetings there. They held elections there. And it's on the New Year's Eve of going into the 20th century, they held a little celebration there late in the afternoon before they moved into the 21st century. So it was a place of meeting for that area of the township. Now the township had just been recently organized, and but you got to remember this, that also at that time, when this was built, the railroad still had not come into Metz. The railroad didn't come through Metz until about 1896. I know Mother said she was about 6 or 7 years old when she watched them put the railroad into Metz, because it did cross Granberg property. And where it crossed the Granville, where it came close to the Granville farm, was only about maybe about an eighth of a mile away. And so Dad said that he went down there and watched them fellas build that railroad. A big event for that one era when that railroad came through there. So before that, these people were just isolated out there. The closest place they could get to was Rogers City, where there were a few general stores, or go to Alpena. And Posen was just a little crossroads. It didn't start to prosper until the railroad come in. And that was the same true with Metz and Hawks and all the rest of them. Until the railroad came through, the D&M, these are all just sleepy little lumber towns, lumber crossroads, where you maybe had a general store. But even the lumbering didn't, Rogers City was the lumber center because it could ship by lake. But anything inland, unless you had a big river to get your lumber to, was a real chore. With the coming of the railroad, of course, they could get the logs out onto the railroad sidings and could ship the logs down to Alpena or other places where they would be turned, where the mills would take them. And that's where a lot of the lumber out of that section of Presque Isle County went to. It went to Alpena. And with the coming of the railroad in there, of course, there were sidings that were set up where gondolas or other flat cars would be sided off, and then the lumbermen would put their logs on there. There was one of those, what's called the Witzke siding. It was over there close to the Granville farm, very close to where Uncle Henry's farm was years ago. And that's where they had a landing, they called it. The logs would come in the wintertime and stacked up alongside the railroad, and then periodically they'd be loaded onto flat cars and on gondolas, and they would be taken off to Alpena. Now, of course, as living on the farm, of course, they had to clear land, and a lot of Dad's time, he said, as a young fella, was, and that was true to all the people, was clearing land, clearing more acreage so that they could plant more crops. And there was a lot of work in farming that had to be done. And of course, you had a certain amount of there. You had cattle, you had horses, you had sheep, you had pigs, you had chickens, and ducks and geese that had to be tended to. And gradually, you diversified your farming a little bit. You raised wheat, and you raised barley, you raised rye, you raised corn. Now, some of the corn, some of the wheat, and some of the rye, of course, was taken to mills to grind into flour for food. And all the farmers did that. And then they had other regular staple crops. There was some corn, and you had crops. You had potatoes and rutabagas, and cabbage. He said his dad had planted a few apple trees first thing, and by the time that he left, he said the orchards were just starting to produce nicely. But you had carrots and beets, and then of course you also had other foods that you relied upon. There wasn't too much wild game. There were a few deer, and occasionally Dad said his dad would shoot deer that came in to raid the yards, and they did eat quite a bit of venison, but it was just food for the table. You saved your crops as much as you could, and even Dad, I told you that story once before, one time shot 2 deer with 1 shot with the rifle. And in the early days, of course, Grandfather had a 10-gauge shotgun, which of course was the only gun that he had, other than he did have a .32 caliber revolver pistol. I found out afterwards from Dad. And then later on, about 1886, Dad said just about a year before his mother died, he did get this .45-60 rifle, Winchester, which I still have right in the next room here hanging on the wall. He bought that for 2 deer hides and $10 bill from a peddler. These peddlers used to come around there periodically. They were like a like a general store on wheels. Quite often there were Jewish fellas that came out of Alpena. I remember one by the name of Zinger. And they would sell pots and pans and kettles and boots and shoes and a certain amount of cloth that they had, needles and threads and saws and hammers and any wide variety of things that people in the rural areas wanted and needed. And they would buy hides. They would buy cow hides. They would buy horse hides if somebody's horse had died. They would buy sheep skin. They would buy wool. And they would take a trip out with a big load of material and then come back with raw, unfinished material. But these purveyors, these peddlers, were also sold, they gave you information about what was happening. They were like newspaper people. They would tell you which farmer just got a new horse or a new colt or new calf, or even that somebody had died up along the way, or children were born, or weddings that were being held. They were because you didn't have newspaper at that time. Dad said, he said occasionally, he said they got a copy of the Advance. But you see, before that, in order to get to Rogers, it was all by horse and buggy or on foot, and before you could go by train. And Alpena, the same with Alpena News. So he said once in a while, he said you got a hold of a newspaper, but he said it wasn't until the train really started coming through after 1896 that they got regular newspapers. So reading materials were sparse, and you had to rely upon the stuff that you had in your schools. He said he started school in the old wooden building, the old wooden school. He said he doesn't really recall who the first teacher that he had, but he said he does. One of his early teachers was a man by the name of Schultz, and then another one was one of the early teachers was a Hardis, one of Grandma Granberg's older brother, or not one of Grandma's brothers. She thought probably it was either Paul or it was Herman that was a teacher there at the Met School at one time. Now, quite frequently afterwards, the teacher at the Granbo School would stay at the Granbo home for room and board. That was very common when you stayed close to one of the, you wouldn't necessarily have to, but I know that a lot of teachers did stay there. Now, the home that the Granbo, that you and I know now that Gerald has, as near as we can figure out, that was built probably about 1899 or 1900. Grandma Hahn, Granbo Hahn, says she's not sure exactly what year that was. But she says all of the kids were born in the log house. And the last kid that that would have been in 97 when Irma was born. She was born in 97, and she was born in the log house. And she says shortly after that, they put up the big house that Gerald occupies today. Of course, it's been remodeled somewhat, but the basic house was put up at that time. And you see, if that's true, well, Dad would have been about 19 years old at that time. And now, there was general farm work to do, Dad said. Now, I got to talk a lot about this stuff with Dad. I might say, how did it come out? Well, you got to remember that when I came back here to teach in 1935, some of the kids were still in school. Ernestine and Treese were in the 8th grade, Grace was in the 10th grade, and George was a senior. Well, then by 1940, everybody had left. I had stayed, when I came back from school, the cheapest place for me to stay, of course, as far as room and board was concerned, was stay with Mother and Dad, and that's what I did. I tried to stay out of the way of the kids, and they're going to school and social functions and everything else. I stayed away as far as possible and let them enjoy it. And I had Ernestine Treese in my class, and I had Grace in my class, in classes in school where I had them as students. But it worked out all right. It came out good. And now, let's see, where was I? I was talking about going to school. When Dad, about building that home. Well, they built that home, and but frequently the teachers in that Met school stayed right there. Now, as you recall, Later on, Dad became a teacher. And he taught school at the Granville School. He taught school at the Gabrishak School. He taught school at the Wisniewski School. Some of these, the Granville School, of course, was right next door. He taught there for a couple of years. I think that's the last school that he taught at, I'm sure. I think he started teaching at the Gabrishak School, which was on the road to Posen, about 2.5 to 3 miles away from home. And he used to walk that back and forth. And in inclement weather, he had made arrangements with some of the families that lived nearby where he could stay overnight. And at the Wisniewski School, that was a good 5 miles away, and he would do the same thing there. Sometimes he would go and stay all week, and or from Monday, he'd go back Sunday evening, and then kind of leave Friday afternoon, and he'd come home for the weekend, because it got to be quite a wrestle, especially, and lots of times there was rough going, very, very rough going, and then come back home at night. So quite often he would stay with a family by the name of Wisniewskis, who would live right next to the school building. And to get back to what Dad did as a youngster, anyway, after well, I'm going to say as here in town, after 1940, everybody left. Twins were gone, Grace was gone, George was gone, or gone a lot. And so I had a chance to spend a lot of time with Dad. Dad loved nothing better than to go hunting and fishing after school, after work. And he loved to go bullhead fishing at Lake Nitty, go to the Spitzer Club, take the boat out, go out and catch a half a dozen or a dozen bullheads. And he enjoyed that. We'd stop in the way back at the Hawks Tavern or Nagel's Tavern and have a beer. Same was true in trout fishing. He loved to go trout fishing at Trout River or the Little Akyak or Silver Creek. He learned to fish trout as a youngster in the creek that ran right in back of the farm. That little creek that's still there today, it runs between the Granville and the Granbrook farm, was a branch of the North Branch. And in those years, Dad said, there were trout in that creek, brook trout. And there were a lot of brook trout in that creek. And so he, and that creek, it started there, started back over there across the railroad track, and flowed down, as you know where the road crossed, where it crosses the road between the Granbrook farm, and it flowed a mile, and then to another road, the main road that goes to Posen, and then meandered about 2 miles before it got into the North Branch River. And he said that's where they did a lot. That's where he started to fish. He said he learned some of the fundamentals of it from a man by the name of Schultz. He said he can't think of his name, but he showed him some of the tricks. Dad fished with a small line. They used black thread. They didn't have it then. They used bigger, heavier lines too for bullheads or for bass or pike in the Thunder Bay River. But these were small fish. These were 7, 8, 9, 10-inch rainbow brook trout. So, and they fished with worms. They fished with crickets. They fished with grasshoppers. Dad showed me how to attach those things. And he said that as a youngster, he used to go down there, probably he was only maybe 12, 13, 14 years old, and take Henry along. And he said they would catch 20 and 30 and 40 trout, anywhere from 7 to 10, 11 inches long. He said it's hard to believe, but he said that is a fact. And he said, of course, with 9 people in the family, he said that made a couple of darn good meals and a couple of nice good meals, and the people that liked it. And I checked that afterwards with Aunt Martha, and she said, that's right. She said they all like to see George go fishing, because then they would have a change in diet. And but she said that if you had 9 people, you clean those up. He said you could have a meal there for probably about 2 meals or 3. And he said that was in the spring of the year, that was a welcome change. And he said they also used to get suckers out of Swan River up to the Christian Granville home. They went up there and they got suckers out of the Swan River. But he showed me a lot of tricks of the trade in fishing for trout. That he said, you got to go where the other people don't want to go. You got to go where it's the roughest, the toughest, the hardest to fish. He said, where other people won't go. He said, you find those deep holes, those deep crevices, and fish with. Of course, he didn't bother with flies or spinners or spoons. He fished with bait. He fished with worms. He fished with crickets. He showed me how to tie on crickets. He showed me how to tie on grasshoppers and beetles and salamanders and bloodsuckers. And even corn, even corn could be tied, strung on a hook, and showed me how to toss the bait in, where to toss it. But primarily was to go to areas where it was hard to fish, where ordinary people wouldn't fish. He said, you go into those deep holes, and he said, you don't have to fish too many places. And he said, if you fish where other people won't fish. Now, he said, there were a few other people that also fished that stream, but he said he got so that he could do it pretty well. And as you remember in later years, when Dad went trout fishing, nobody else probably would catch fish. Dad would catch fish, is because the techniques that he used. He understood currents in the water. He showed me how to read the currents and how to chum, how to use bait, and to throw in my chum, you might say, throw in food to find out where bait was in the holes and how to detect whether the fish were there. There's certain signs that you could read by. So it was very, very wonderful. And even in later years, we'd go out to Big Akyak, sit and he would smoke a pipe and just sit there, and we fished for brown trout on a few evenings out there till 10, 11 o'clock at night, and caught some dandies. But that's what he liked. He'd call me up. I was at work, and he would call up and say, let's go fishing tonight. Well, I'd check with Marion, and if I was in the clear, I'd go and pick him up, and away we'd go. Sometimes we'd go to Silver Creek. Sometimes we'd go to Lost Lake to fish for bullheads or bass, or sometimes we'd go to the Spitzer Club, there where he belonged, and the boats were available. So it was, and in these periods when we would sit there, I'd ask him about a lot of those things, about how it was, what did they do? Well, he said that as a youngster, there's on a farm you always got work. You got horses to tend, you got cattle to tend, you got barns to clean. You got, in the summertime, you had weeds that you had to clear out of the vegetable gardens. The vegetable garden was very, very important to those farm people, because that's where they raise their potatoes, that's where they raise their rutabagas, and their beets, and their carrots, and their corn. And you had to protect that against rodents. You had to protect it against rabbits. And he said they did get quite a few rabbits. He said the rabbit was a good change of food, and also in the fall of the year they did get quite a few partridge. He said after the lands were cut over, the partridge came in. They came back, and sometimes he said there'd be a flock of 20, 30 partridge that you would encounter. And he said he said the dad, well, he harvested the crop. He harvested those partridge almost like you harvest chickens. He would bait them into an area where he put out an amount of corn and other feed concealed in back of the garage, someplace in back of the barn, and he would send back maybe about 20 yards, and he'd wait till those birds came in, because they always came in there to feed. He'd wait until they get about 20 or 25 in a small area, and then he'd let go. He might get 10 or 12 of those, and he said they made a good meal. Now you say, well, that isn't fair. Well, you got to remember, these people were meat hunting. They were hunting for food, because a flock of 25 or 30 partridge could eat a lot of peas, dried peas on you, or dried beans. So he said it was give and go all the time. And he said the same was true with venison. He said the venison were shot whenever they would appear, the deer, because he said a deer could really dig up your beets and rutabagas, something fierce if they got into your garden. So he said periodically Dad would be out there late in the evening and watch those deer come in, They get close enough, he'd hammer them down, and the neighbors will say, well, there's Grambo shooting deer again. But as I say, they always gave, some of the neighbors always gave him some venison too. And then he said, as kids, we performed chores. Though there was some recreation, we picked huckleberries, we picked raspberries, wild blackberries, and occasionally we picked some wild cranberries, elderberries. My dad made elderberry wine, and his dad made elderberry wine. And then of course there were a few times where they would pick hazelnuts. Hazelnut bushes there were not too many there, but there were quite a few of them near the Rogers City area, and beech nuts. And but I remember one time he said that his dad in the Granville farm, the woods were really adjacent to it, just a short distance away were the woods. And he got stung. He went out there one day and he got stung quite a few times with bees. He wondered what was going on. And then he happened to spot up in here was an old maple tree that was about half dead. And he looked up and he could see a large number of bees congregating on the outside up there. And apparently there was a bee's nest up there. But then he noticed some glistening up there, and they went back in the evening. He took a stick and crawled up there and got a hold of some of that stuff, and it was honey. So he knew that there was honey. It was a honey tree. Well, it was too dangerous to try to take that thing down, so but he knew where it was. So in the fall of the year, after it froze down, around November, December, he got some of his neighbors, and they went out and got that tree. He said it was a maple. He said that was probably about 25 or 30 inches through at the bottom, half dead. So they felled it very carefully, and he said a large limb had broken off and created I suppose, the makings of a cavity, and it had rotted out, and the bees had found that. And before that, he said, apparently rodents or coons or squirrels had cleaned it out, and that's where the bees had made a big beehive, big nest or cone. And he said when they finally got that thing separated out of there, he said they got about almost the equivalent of a wash tub full of honey. And of course, he said that was a big treat, and because for biscuits or anything else. And he mentioned that one of the Schott boys, that would have been Ed Schott, no doubt. He was a brother to Amelia. He was in on that. And Henry and Otto and other were also in on that, who helped in that. So, and there were a few rabbits around who occasionally did that, but you didn't. But when you hunted, because the cartridges were expensive, he said you made darn sure that you were going to get something with it. You just didn't shoot into the air. So then, there were on the farm. There was horses, and there were cattle, there were hogs, there were sheep, there were chicken, and there were ducks. There were some geese, and the food. A lot of the food, of course, in the summertime was a problem because you had no refrigeration. But the food, a lot of food was salted, brined, what you would call today for the beef, or you'd say was corned beef, bully beef. And the pigs were, some of it, the beef was also smoked, but the hogs, were cut up, bacon, ham, and sausage, and a lot of that, of course, was kept for the winter season, or carried even over into the spring, and in order to vary the diet a little bit. And they did have a pretty good supply of cheese, cottage cheese, and cattle, of course, not only for the milk but for the cheese. And they smoked some. They did smoke some fish that they would catch in the fall of the year out of the Thunder Bay River, and some of that was dried. And they also put up large quantities of sauerkraut and that was a very, very common food. And as a youngster, you learned, of course, how to handle horses, how to handle cattle, and the milking, and also how to handle the farm, various pieces of farm equipment, how to plow, how to drag, how to disc, and then also helped to take part in the thrashing. And now, then of course, as he got a little older, then he went out to go and help other people. Now there were lots of exchange of labor in the farms in those early days. If people went out, if farm fellow wanted to build a new home, he had a farm, he had a home raising. In other words, he'd get the materials together, hire a carpenter who understood the fundamentals, and maybe on a Saturday or on a Sunday, whenever they could get a gang of men together, they might. Now you didn't pay that labor. In other words, if you went over, he said, if I went over and helped a farmer put up a new barn, and I worked there for several days, then somewhere down near on the end of the line, he came back and he helped you. Or if the farmer got sick and he couldn't work his fields, neighbors would come in. He said, I recall doing that on several occasions. When a neighbor got hurt in an accident, he broke an arm or broke a leg, go over and help the fellow out. In other words, sometimes they needed to help because the man of the house was hurt or he was sick. And so they helped each other out. These people were always exchanging labor, and that's the way they got things done. And now he said there was some levity too. They did a lot of socializing. In other words, people got together frequently for birthdays or anniversaries or weddings, events, and 4th of July and things of that type. He said on a few occasions during the years, he did get to Roger City. And a few occasions during the years, he did get to Alpena. Now, it became more common after the railroad went in, yes. But he said he recalls taking a trip with his dad to Alpena by horse and buggy. He said that was an all-day event. He said that was about 25, 28 miles. We went by Posen and Long Rapids, and then the River Road. So, but he said, so you occasionally did get out, but it was a long, long haul. To Rogers, it was a little bit different, but nevertheless, that was only about 12 miles, the shortest area. But nevertheless, that was a good long hike. And and some people used to walk it. But he said that you did enjoy your association with your neighbors, and it was good. Now here I'd just like to interject a factor that I thought was interesting. Amelia, after, as you remember, Herman died, and she married a Gus Hahn from Alpena and went there to live. Well, then after a period of time, Gus died, and she came back and she spent most of her time living with Otto and Dora in Metz. But she was a kind of a very dissatisfied individual, as you probably may or not know. She would live with Otto and Dora, and then she'd come back and she would stay a week or 10 days with Martha, and then she would go and stay with Irma. She'd come over to our place and stay with George and Alma for a while, and she would go back. And I think on a few occasions she went down to stay with Willie. And I don't know whether she stayed with Ed or not. But when she'd come over to see Aunt Martha, and Aunt Martha is right now where I sit, I can see Aunt Martha's home. She lives right across the alley from us. She lives on another street. And when we go out of our back gate here of our yard, I only have to go across the alley, and there's Aunt Martha's home. I can walk right in the back door. Well, Amelia used to come there and stay with Martha, and then when she found out that, of course, Marion was over here, this would be in the summertime, she'd come over and visit with Marion. And for some reason or other, the two got along just fine. Marion, of course, was a good listener, and Amelia loved to talk. And Marion was fascinated, always had to, even for the first time she found out, how in the heck a young girl of 14 years old would walk in, take care of 3 little kids. and then started to raise her family of her own when she was 15. And so she had an opportunity to talk with her, and she just very bluntly asked her, and Amelia apparently liked it, that she liked to talk. And Marion asked her, she said, well, wasn't that strange that you went in there as a young girl and just walked right in to start taking care of these kids? And she said that Grandma said no, she didn't think there was anything strange about it, that was just natural. The fact that she got married